Welcome to our session. I would like to welcome you all this morning for our Fructophilic yeast session. I've been working on this trial for the last 3 months, so we're going to discuss this, see what results we got out of the trial. We have my panel members here, and I would like to welcome Susan Luker, that's Director of Winemaking at Simi Winery. Scientist at heart, she studied viticulture and enology at UC Davis. During one of her classes, she visited Dry Creek Valley and tasted old Zinfandel wine. Nowadays, she's sampling out of those blocks of Zinfandel and making really good wines at Simi. Susan worked at Sonoma Top Wineries, Ascenda Winery, Kendall Jackson, Dry Creek Winery, and she joined Simi Winery in 2000. So up to 19 vintages at Simi Winery, where she's making balanced wines with harmony, integrity, and a sense of place. And that is basically who Susan is as a person as well. So Susan, welcome to our panel. Jeff Hinsliff. So Jeff, after brewing a bad batch of homebrew, so I guess it was beer, he took a friend's advice to investigate brewing a brewing program at UC Davis. After graduating, loan debt in those days, and I think we still have loan debt, and a lack of good brewing, permanent brewing jobs available, he landed an enologist position at Christian Brothers, where he helped develop their oxygen control program. After that, Jeff went back to Mendocino County, where he's from, as winemaker at Eden Cellars. And he founded Gabrielli Winery along with his college friend Sam Gabrielli. He joined Anna Winery, Winery and Vineyards in 1998. He directs winemaking and worked closely together with Dr. Chris Anna and his assistant winemaker Marty Quinn. Their wines must be intense, vibrant, terroir-driven, and delicious. So that is Jeff. Jeff, welcome to our panel.
Thank you.
Then we have Jason Mubbett, born and raised in New Zealand. He developed a taste for wine growing up in West Auckland. I guess he was watching rugby and drinking wine instead of drinking beer. He graduated from the University of Lincoln, New Zealand. He worked harvest as a winemaker in Argentina, Australia, Chile, and USA. And he joined AB Biotech in 2009, looking after the Americas as technical advisor, and recently moved to St. Louis to look solely after North American market. He also has established a wine brand, an Argentinian wine brand called Manos Negras. So thanks, Jason, for joining us. I'm going to start off with Jason to do us his presentation. Jason.
I actually abbreviated the title just to get it on the page. So this is what I want to do is set the background, if you like, for this discussion about fructophilic yeast. And I think one of the things which we're all very cognizant about is rising alcohol levels in wine. I mean, historically, wine was something which would be between 12 and 13 degrees alcohol. Recently, we've seen a market increase. We're now seeing wines which are 15%, 16%. You know, those wines, while not common, they're definitely out there now. And I think this is sort of the background which we really need in order to have this discussion about fructophilic yeast. So I think there's basically two major realities with regards to this. One of them is obviously the influences, if you like, the likes of Robert Parker and people like that. I think they've changed the perception of wine to a certain degree. And so now what we're looking for is wines with very fruit forward, which have high levels of ripe fruit, softer tannins, new oak influence. And what we've found that these wines are generally receiving higher points. So, as a consequence, other winemakers are looking to mimic these wines, and, as a consequence, in order to get those characteristics, alcohol levels are going up. I think, so that's one sort of side of it. There's the commercial, being driven for commercial reasons, and then the other side is related to kind of grape growing. Basically, I think we've become much more aware of the distinction between sugar ripeness and then also physiological ripeness. And what we tend to find in warmer climates is that typically physiological ripeness trails sugar ripeness. And physiological ripeness, I think, is often more detrimental to wine quality than, say, sugar ripeness. So, and part of that is to do with the grape growth. Broadly speaking, grape growth is broken down into 3 phases. And in the first phase, basically what we're seeing more glucose accumulate than fructose, and that generally as we progress through the vintage and that ratio changes. Now, this is something which hasn't really been studied a lot. I actually discussed this with the University of California, Davis. They didn't have much data on this, but I was able to, from a person that I work with in the industry, get some examples of this. So basically what this is Central Coast Pinot Noir. And what this graph shows is the change in the ratio between glucose and fructose. So below, you'll see these are the sample points when they take these measurements. So right at the start of the grape ripening process, we see in the case of Pinot Noir, it's roughly a ratio of 14:1 in terms of glucose to fructose. As we move through the ripening period, we'll see that it gets down to 1:1, and in some cases actually drops below 1:1. So you actually have more fructose than glucose. Now, one of the important things to recognize is that this is actually varietally, it differs between varietals. So if we look at, this is Pinot Noir from the Central Coast, and this is Cabernet Sauvignon from the Central Coast. So while the general theme is the same, in certain varietals what you're seeing is the accumulation of more fructose than glucose than other varietals. And that's why I think in certain fermentations you're more likely to have an issue with, say, a Chardonnay ferment as opposed to a Chenin Blanc ferment. And so what we have to really do is take into account varietal and the influence of varietals. Unfortunately, there's been very, very little work done on this, and this is one thing which we would like to investigate, because we need to understand this from a North American perspective. I don't think data generated overseas will necessarily be too helpful, because we're dealing with different varietals. And so, kind of what are the consequences of this? I think, it's generally accepted that in about 95% of the cases where we have a stuck or problematic fermentation, generally what we find is that the ratio of glucose to fructose is less than 1. So we're dealing with something where there is more fructose than glucose. This number, I think, is very different from what we would have seen probably 20 or 30 years ago. It would have probably been much, much lower in terms of, but now the predominant issue with regards to suck fermentations is this relationship between glucose and fructose. Now, why is that? Well, generally speaking, Saccharomyces cerevisiae is a gluctophilic yeast. It can consume fructose, but generally it preferentially consumes glucose as opposed to fructose. And so, as a consequence, what we see is that the proportion of fructose increases during the fermentation. When fructose becomes the predominant sugar at the end of fermentation, this will often lead to sluggish or stuck fermentations. Now, what are the effects of this and the consequences? Well, what we should recognize is that fructose is approximately 2 times as sweet as glucose. So, there's a marked difference in terms of having a lot of fructose left over at the end of fermentation and a lot of glucose left over at the end of fermentation. So obviously also this will affect our ethanol yield. High residual fructose means we will get lower ethanol yields, and that also increases the risks of perhaps microbial spoilage. To a certain degree, what we can actually do is use yeast strains which will preferentially consume that fructose as a way of perhaps mitigating this issue to a degree. Because what is the reality? I think, kind of the really interesting thing here is that, kind of in 1932, there was a paper published which looked at, kind of the selective fermentation of glucose and fructose by yeast. And, kind of very interestingly, in this paper, the conclusion was that, kind of This selectivity exhibited by any particular yeast is not necessarily constant. It's to do with environmental factors, and that's something that we really have to take into account. It's really dependent on cultural conditions to which the yeast have been subjected during the growth phase. And, more recently, Linda Basson, she's also pointed out that, the concentration of, high residual concentration of fructose may actually be a symptom as opposed to a cause or a sort of sluggish fermentation. So in saying that we can use yeast which will preferentially consume fructose, that's not to say that we'll necessarily solve the problem 100% of the times. And the reason for that is that generally fermentation problems arise through the presence and impact of more than one stress factor. And that's why it's often very hard to solve a particular thing, because there's an interplay between these factors. And then, so when we have more than one factor, basically they have a synergistic effect on one another, and, which complicates it even further. But obviously we can't avoid some of these things. Alcohol, for example, there's nothing we can do about increasing levels of alcohol, but alcohol is toxic to yeast. So, there's certain things you cannot avoid anyway. There are other things which you can avoid, such as temperature spikes or, incorrect rehydration of the yeast, all those things which are likely to affect yeast performance, but there's certain things we can't avoid. So ultimately that's where we have to ensure that we're selecting the right yeast. What are the wine yeast guardrails? Well, each strain, the strain performance is determined by genotype. Or genetic makeup, and that's species and strain dependent. And so wine yeast strains differ in terms of many things: nitrogen requirements, ethanol tolerance, pH tolerance, temperature tolerance, glucose fructose consumption, fermentation kinetics. So and what we find is that these differences are exacerbated, when a yeast is placed under stress and in stressful conditions. So what are our recommendations? We have to take into account differences between varietals. We also have to take into account vintages. A cooler vintage is likely to see less fructose being generated. A warmer vintage will increase the potential for more fructose to be, generated during the ripening phase. We we're worried about high potential alcohols, have a look at the sugars potentially before we actually choose the yeast we use. Where there is more fructose than glucose, we have to pay attention to other risk factors, low nitrogen levels, for example. Basically, what we're suggesting is that it's very important your initial decision with regards to what yeast strain you're going to use. So, what are we doing as yeast manufacturers to, to solve this issue? Recently, we've embarked on some application trials with the University of California, Davis. We've fermented old vine Zinfandel to over 19 degrees alcohol with a wine yeast, which we're somewhat surprised by. We're looking to release that data this year. So we're trying to understand what's going on here in the United States, understand the varietals. Basically, as I was saying, we're looking at doing vineyard sampling to get a better understanding of the accumulation of sugars. And from a technical standpoint, we're actually doing quite a bit of research with regards to this. We're investigating other species apart from Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which might be able to resolve this issue. We're looking at selective breeding and hybridization. We're actually also doing an adaptive evolution project at the moment to hopefully come up with a strain which evolves in a non-GMO way, which will allow us to resolve this issue. And importantly, what we're also trying to do is understand the wine microorganism physiology, because that's fundamental in this. So in summary, what I'd say is that there are certain things we can do to further mitigate these things, this issue, and under high ethanol conditions, fructose utilization was inhibited more than glucose utilization. However, if you have a high starting YAN, for whatever reason, that will lead to the yeast preferentially consuming fructose at the start of fermentation at much higher levels than if you have a low YAN environment. So it's very important to perhaps increase your YAN levels, and Tinus is going to talk a little bit more about this. And what we've also found is that assimilated nitrogen stimulates fructose fermentations preferentially. So nitrogen is something which is fundamental with regards to these risky fermentations. And I think in many respects, one of the things that I think is really important is that we don't forget what's happened in the past, when making decisions, because often we can be guided by problems and issues we've had in the past. And to that extent, I think it's really important that we collect data which is useful moving forward. So that's sort of setting the scene. I'll hand it back now to Tinus, but thank you very much.
I have asked Jeff and Susan to talk about their experiences in the past and this current vintage, and just their philosophy of how do they decide what to select, which yeast strain, and then also with fermentation on their wine. So Jeff, can you just give us your feedback and how you do your selection, and yeah, it'll be nice.
Yeah, I guess where would Chardonnay be in California if we'd had fructophilic yeast in 1982? Dry? I doubt it.
1982?
Wasn't it 82? So we love the fructophilic yeast. It's, I think in the current contemporary winemaker's toolbox, it's an essential, probably maybe the most essential. So with fructophilic yeast, we can do some wacky things and know that we can pull out of a steep dive relatively easily. So it's given us a little bit of freedom. For instance, if you were looking at, we want to do some Sauvignon Blanc non-anoc. We're looking at decent Yan numbers and relatively low potential alcohol, so it looks like a pretty good candidate. Well, in 2018, we set up a couple of these non-anoc fermentations. One of them, we had great cell counts, and in the second one, not so good. So we had, just after a few days of vigorously trying to increase the number of native Saccharomyces, we only had about 1 million cells per mill. So that's about 10 cells in a field of 1,000, which, by the way, if you're playing with yeast, get a microscope. It'll last your career. One investment of $5,000, $10,000, and you got a tool that you can use until you retire. So we noticed pretty early on in this Sauv Blanc that things weren't going well, and so we whipped out a can of Baianus, and once we had started to see it slow from 1.5 bricks, 2 bricks a day to 0.5, then looked at the cell count, we said, we're flattening out, let's get the Baianus in. Couple of days of lag phase, looked under the scope, saw the big ovoidal cells with the bunny ears. We knew we had a pretty good implant, and off she went, and is dry now at 13.4, so modest alcohol, virtually no residual sugar. So it's interesting because we don't look per se at ratios. There may be some winemakers out there that do, but we make assumptions. So if, for instance, another case this year was a Petit Verdot, that because of Petit Verdot's very high tannin, we were at a tannin level early on at 18 bricks. We said, wow, we're already at 1,400 tannin here. Let's pull the plug. Well, at 18 bricks, things really hadn't gotten going yet in terms of the yeast population. So we drained and pressed, and then took a look at the drain wine and the press wine, and we had, pretty low population, but we saw a lot of budding. It was only 18. We said, let's ride this out. So we rode it out from 16 or so when we pressed, and then close to 5 bricks, flattening out, fast. So again, we went to Baianus. We did a single day restart, in a rehydration nutrient. And then, I think this was on a Friday, and I said, let's not even look at it until Monday. So get the yeast in, and then when Monday came around, 3 days later, we dropped something like 1.5 bricks, and the wine, after like a month and a half of fermentation, is finally dry. In fact, we just sent it out for RS today. So those are a couple of uses. The other one we use if we're pressing early, and we have a variety that a Bordeaux variety called Saint Macaire that's hugely tannic. So we routinely press that one early. We know we're going to press it early. So we usually, in that case, have, I'm talking early, 20 bricks. And so we usually don't have the cell count that we need to finish fermentation, so we'll often re-inoculate that almost immediately after pressing. Yes? Yes?
What's your nutrition regime like? Do you some blanc, for example?
Yeah, so I mean, we'd love to have 250, 300, 400 yen in these wines. You know, it'd be wonderful, but you know, usually that's Pinot Noir territory, and you know, you really got to work hard to stick Pinot. So you know, we're typically in this season. I can say we had some 60 yen wines, so very low, and 27 sugar. We know we're going to have trouble. I mean, you can't get enough yen. A yen in a can ain't going to do it on its own for those, I don't think. So, you know, endogenous yen, real yen really seems to help more, but we certainly adjust as much as we can with alpha amino supplements, yeast supplements, and DAP as necessary. But if you're at 80, it's tough to get to 250 unless you want to load up with tons of DAP, and we really don't want to do that. Pardon? So we used to stick to the dogma of making multiple additions, but now our fermentations are so fast, typically in the reds, that we get all our yen in. Once we see the cells starting to bud, we'll get all our yen in a single day. So that's kind of our approach there. Some of the things we're looking at when we're deciding whether we're going to, how much Baianis to buy in the year are some of the indications are early pressing, as I mentioned, low yen, high potential alcohol, over 15.5% in white wines. Now that people are starting to float up here, we're running into problems with low NTU. Sometimes you forget or you don't get your NTUs where you want them. So if you're below 100 NTU and a potential high alcohol white, you better be prepared to deal with that as well. You know, in the old days, I was thinking about the old days when in putting these notes down, I said, you know what? Like, we didn't have stuck cabs and Chardonnays back in the day. We were picking Chard at 22.5 to 24 maybe. Whole cluster pressing, probably fermenting it. We didn't use NTUs. 1.5, 2% solids, and they went dry. Same thing for cab. You know, you're picking at 22.5 to 24 sugar, keeping it on the skins until dryness, 13.5 potential alcohol, and things went dry. So, I mean, I think the current, as Jason mentioned, this surge in alcohol levels that I think initially started from the concept of physiological ripeness, but once the accountants found out that the winery water is so much cheaper than the vineyard water, then the driver became less winemaking and more financial. So,
another discussion.
So, another example of success with Baianis is with non-inoculated Chardonnay. So this year we did a non-inoculated, all our Chardonnay is non-inoculated, but we could not get the cell count to the degree we wanted. We saw that cell population and Brix curve slow down, and so we actually we try to get the fermentation going quickly in a tank before going to barrel if we're doing a non-inox Chardonnay. So in this case, rather than getting it into barrel, finding out that it's slow at that point and dealing with all the logistical nightmare during harvest of re-inoculating in barrel, perhaps taking it back out of barrel into tank, when there's tons of other things going on, we re-inoculated at 15 Brix with Byanus, not looking at fructose levels, but just knowing that this yeast is going to take us to dryness before we got into barrel. So I think it's a really versatile tool, and I think if you have a few things in the winery like a microscope and the ability to look at cell counts, you can intervene at the right time. I'm not saying that you shouldn't use, sophisticated glucose fructose analysis, as it might be helpful. It just hasn't been part of our procedure, and we've managed to get in the last few years basically everything dry, and in many cases just because we used the fructophilic yeast. Thanks.
Susan, please.
So I am not a fructophilic yeast fan, or not a Byanus fan. I tend to select yeasts based on varietal and sugar level. So my experience in the past has been that EC 1118 was a pretty generic flavor provider, so I would use something else in its place. So that was really what got me interested in doing this, was if there are fructophilic yeasts or Byanus yeasts that can help you with a high alcohol fermentation, because we are definitely trending on picking at higher Brix each year. And this one was no exception. I think this wine came in at around 26 and soaked up to 27 plus. And this wine we wanted to really kind of challenge the yeasts, but we wanted to see if we could get fructophilic yeast that actually had good fruit expression and was not generic. So for me, the EC 1118 is a very generic yeast as far as fruit expression. Same with, Uva Firm 43 is a fabulous yeast to finish, but most of the times you end up using it as a finisher, because you don't want, if you fermented everything with Uva Firm, you'd end up with kind of boring fruit profile. So that leads me to the tasting. Is it time? Can we taste, Tinus?
Let me do the results of the trial, and then we can taste.
These are not boring, though, I think you'll find.
So I'm just going to give you the results. The goals of the trial was to see if fructophilic yeast consume fructose faster than a non-fructophilic yeast. To see if there is any profile differences between the 4 strains that we used. And then we obviously prevent stuck fermentation because CME, we use 20 tons, so I don't want to have a stuck fermentation on one of the tanks of Alexander Valley Cabernet. So the grapes, we got Alexander Valley Cabernet. The objective was to achieve maximum ripeness. So this year, the average Brix was about 27. This was one day after soaking. The 4 tanks came in 26.2. One tank was 26.6. So after one day of soaking, it ended up with 27 Brix. Previous years, an average Brix achieved for this block was 25 plus. And then no dilution of the grapes after soaking. The fermentation, so what we've done is the fermentation, we use 2 7.5 ton fermenters and 2 5-ton fermenters, this open fermenters. We use the winery protocol, cool fermentation with 2 punch downs daily. So we crush on day 1, soak up to day 2, and then the inoculation of the yeast was in day 3. The yeast strains, I'm just going to call it, and you can see also on the tasting sheet, is T1 is a fructophilic yeast, T2 fructophilic, and then 3 and 4 is non-fructophilic yeast. For the analysis, we decided to outsource the analysis, so we use ETS for the fructophilic or the glucose and fructose analysis. Before fermentation, we did the total YAN of all the tanks. So it was the same block, but we analyzed each tank individually just to see that we have that we can compare apples with apples. And then during fermentation, we measure Brix, glucose, and fructose. So monitoring the YAN during fermentation, you can see there the YAN 77 to 87, so the same grape. So the starting YAN, let's say average was 80, and we increase it to 160 incrementally, so it was done over 2-3 days. The recommended, just as a standard, the recommended YAN for high-risk fermentation, because according to what we will say in nutrition additions, with a Brix of 27, that's a high-risk fermentation, and we would recommend to have a 350 YAN for a Brix of 27. So, but we decided to go to 160, and that's also Susan's philosophy, is not to go too much on nutritions and not too high YAN. So what we saw with the Brix, so T1 in this case, pretty normal curve. So there we see T2, so T2 faster, a little bit faster on the end, starting on the same time. T3 slower in the beginning, but then caught up at day 10, and then finish a little faster than T1. And then we have T4, that was pretty much the same in the beginning, but it finished 4 days later than the first yeast, T2. So what we see now is with the Brix, it starts together slowly, and then the T1 and T2 is the fructophilic yeast. At a faster fermentation came down, and then at that point, T3 caught up with the 2 fructophilic yeast, and then they start to finish the fermentation.
Do you have temperature data?
Yeah, it is in the next slide. I'll show you that.
It got cold.
Small fermenters, it was late in the season.
Outside.
Yeah.
Tinus, it might be interesting to just let everyone know that T4 is actually part of the PDM clade, the PDM family. So that's a strain which was historically considered as Bayanus. So it's interesting that that one, which that family's always been regarded as a very strong fermenter, very reliable and very neutral. It was interesting that that was the one which finished last out of the 4 strains, and that's part of the PDM clade. So, we're talking about EC118, PDM, DV10, Premier Cuvée, IOC 18 2007, they're all from the same family, and K1 is another one, for example. So it's interesting, we regard those as being very strong fermenters, and yet that was the one that finished last. So the RS, we took it, so I have a luxury of $1,200 to my budget for the analysis. So we took the glucose fructose separate 5 times. So this is just to see how the RS dropped down. T2 a little faster, and then it's mainly to the end of fermentation where it was faster with the RS finishing. T3 we could see the same as the Brix curves, slower in the beginning but caught up to the end. And then T4 pretty much the same as T3 but finished a little later. So temperature, as Susan also mentioned, you can see the temperature was we did cold, well, it was not a choice, but it was very cold during the nights. It got in at 10C for the soaking. Then 3 days later, the inoculation was around 12C, 12 centigrade.
I believe I did warm them at the end of fermentation, too.
Yeah, so what we did
If
is we warmed the tanks, the first 2 tanks there, just to get above 20, 19 to 20. And then the T3 and T4, we warmed during that time. So yes, I would say, considering the temperature, it was a stressed ferment for these yeast strains, but it was also to see how these yeast strains are going to perform under more stressed conditions. So if we look at the fructose consumption, so we started off with day 0. So day 0, this is the day when we inoculated. So what we see there is T1 and T2, the fructophilic yeast, drop 4 days into fermentation, 10% and 18% of the fructose, consume 10 to 18% of the fructose. So the glucophilic yeast consume, or the non-fructophilic yeast consume the fructose slower. Then 2 days later, the T1 and T2, the fructophilic yeast consume 40% and 43%, so much faster than the non-fructophilic yeast. That is 17 and 30%, but then they caught up on the end. So T1, T2, 95 and 99%, and then T3, 96%. So the yeast strain 3 at that time caught up. So a lot is happening between day 6 and day 12. So the non-fructophilic yeast will use or consume a lot of the fructose that hasn't been consumed as fast as the fructophilic yeast in the beginning. So now if we look at glucose, the same with that. 4 days later, T1, T2 consume 44 and 41% of the glucose, with T3 and T4 20 and 23%. Then the same 76%, 74%. So even faster consumption of the RS, the glucose, by the fructophilic yeast. And then on the 10th, the 12th day, you can see 100% for T1, T2 and T3, and then still the one that ferments a little longer has consumed 99% of the glucose. So if we look at T1, just the individual tanks, you can see there, and you can just read there, after day 4, day 6, and day 12. So just a drop on comparing fructose to glucose, how they consume the two. And then T1, you can see here on the end, at day 12, we have like 7.1 of the fructose left, with 0.3 of the glucose. But then two days later, it went down to 3.4. But then a few days later, yeah, it went to 0.2 and 0.1. T2, the same, faster. This is the yeast that finished the first 12 days of fermentation. Let me just go, yeah. So this yeast finished 14 days, and this is 2 consecutive days below zero bulling, so minus bulling. So this one is 14 days, T2 was 12 days. And you can see that the fructose and glucose was consumed faster than T1. T3, here on the end, you can see, so it caught up with the other 2 yeasts, but then we still have a lot of glucose there. Fructose is lower, but then on day 17, it was 0.1 and 0.1. Fructose, T4 was the yeast that fermented the longest, 17 days. And then here we can see on the end is where most of the time the problem starting is like where you have more fructose left. So it's a strong yeast strain, and it finished the fermentation in 17 days after inoculation. So what is our conclusions? So fructophilic yeast consume fructose faster than non-fructophilic yeast. I think we all know that, but you can see that in the trial. In this case, the non-fructophilic yeast strain T3 caught up with the 2 fructophilic yeast, so that caught up. So the T1 fermented days, I say 14 days. This was from inoculation, 2 days below zero. And then this was 15 days, so this was when the wine was dry. Oh man, excuse me. T2, 12 days and 13 days, so the fastest fermenter. and 13 days it was dry. T3, 13 days and 16 days when it was dry, and then T4, 17 days and 18 days when it was totally dry. The fermentation kinetics, so the sweet spot for problems is around, I would say, 12 bricks to 5 bricks. So in that time, if you have a slower fermentation, or if you want to do re-inoculation, that will be the best time to do it. With Jeff's strategy, with some of his red grapes, when he prays at 18 bricks and you see that there is a slow fermentation, then you inoculate at that time. So, but in general, I would say 5 bricks to 12 bricks, that is your problematic stage. So we're going to taste the wines now. I'll give you like 2 to 3 minutes just to smell through the wines and taste it. Yes?
What were the size of the fermentation lots, and why was fermentation so cold?
It was machine harvested fruit that came in first thing in the morning, so it came in about 10 degrees Celsius.
And then you held it, you didn't let it go? You never went above 20?
I actually ended up warming the tanks to...
What's the size of the fermentation?
The T1 and T2 were 7-ton fermenters, and T3 and T4 were 5-ton fermenters.
Any questions at this time?
I did notice the vibrational acidity difference, significant on T3. Why was much lower?
T3, actually, I think it metabolized. None of these have finished ML. Actually, none of them have started ML. So, but T3 looks like it metabolized more malic. So it's about 0.8 compared to over 1 for the others.
Did you have to water these ferments, Susan?
I would have watered it back, except for I was trying to stress the yeast. I was trying to stump the yeast to see how fructophilic they were. I mean, I thought it would be good to challenge them, but in the normal winery situation, I would have probably watered back to 25.
So you spoke a lot about reds. I have a problem of fructose and stuck fermentation on whites. I'm picking grapes early. It's 19 bricks. It's sparkling base wine. High acid, low pH, low sugar. We check the YAN. We check the NTU. We inoculate everything with a EC1118, which is a biannuous high index of fructophilic, yeast. And we get a very sluggish fermentation, not all the time, but I would say recently, the last 5-6 years, I would say, a higher percentage than before, and everything is pretty much picked always around that 19 bricks. So we talked about stress factors. Could we go over those stress factors and things that may create stuck, sluggish, and obviously fructose left at the end of fermentation, because I don't seem to get my head wrapped around what's going on.
EC1118 is from the PDM clade. The interesting thing about the PDM clade is that there are slight variations between the strains. So you actually do have some members of the PDM clade which will preferentially consume fructose over glucose. One of them is, for example, Marvin Pop or the IOC 18-2007. So it may be interesting to try some of those to see if you can, if that's the type of yeast you're wanting to use. That family, it's it's the most important winemaking family in the world. I think historically, And the reason it's so important is that they've got a number of very positive attributes, that family. It's generally a very robust fermenter. You can ferment at cool temperatures and hot temperatures. It's generally got low nitrogen requirements as well. Perhaps the negative with regards to that family is they tend to produce relatively neutral wines. They certainly don't apport a lot, as a general overview of that family. And certainly with regards to, if you're worried about fructose and white wines, there are other strains which you could consider using which are somewhat more fructophilic. We can talk about QA23 from Lallemand and also Marivin. There's a couple of strains in the Marivin range as well, Elegance. There are strains which are better suited for white wine fermentations, which are much more fructophilic than, say, something like EOC 18-2007 or the Marivin Pop. you know. And it's my job and you know, kind of the Lallemand representatives and you know, kind of to inform you of these subtle differences, because there are subtle differences between them, and we have to inform you of not only the positive attributes but also the negative attributes, you know. And unfortunately, we only get one chance a year to do, you know, any trials, and trials are often perceived as being headaches. You know, so we have to try and give you as much information as possible so you can make informed decisions and hopefully solve this problem, you know, or get a better result.
Do a trial with them next year.
So you're always back to the yeast choices. I've tried more UVA 43 and didn't work out the way I wanted. So you know, I'm talking about stress factors.
I often think that the biggest stress factor related to wine fermentation is incorrect rehydration. You know, because you know, what we essentially do as yeast manufacturers is we create a living organism and then we put it to sleep. You know, and we rely on winemakers and cellar hands to rehydrate the yeast in a way which will bring it back to, you know, the perfect beast that it was before we would put it to sleep. So I think that, you know, kind of the rehydration protocol is fundamental, you know, and then obviously the other stress factors you have to consider are to do with nitrogen requirements, temperature. You know, some yeasts will operate at very cool temperatures, other yeasts won't. You know, if we look at EPA or EP2, for example, anything below 15 degrees Celsius, they're going to struggle, they're going to produce flavours you don't want, you know, so we have to inform you of these things, you know, kind of, and, you know, the idea is to give you enough information so that you can be much more confident in the yeast selection that you're making, you know. And unfortunately, it is a work in progress, you know. Sometimes we solve the problem the first time, you know, but as I say, we only get one opportunity a year, and, you know, often it takes a couple of years, you know, to truly establish what you're looking for and to truly establish what the problem is.
Do you use rehydration nutrients?
Yes.
Because I think that was a big step.
And we create our own yeast culture. So basically we start and then we make a liquid yeast culture that we build, and we use this and then basically inoculate. So the yeast have been actually fermenting that with alcohol already. So they've been in fermenting conditions once they are.
I mean, that's also, I mean, an issue as well, because one thing which I don't think is commonly known is that when we produce the yeast, the maximum alcohol level we get during the production process is about 0.3 degrees alcohol. We never get higher than 0.3. When a winery reproduces yeast in a winery situation, you've got increasing alcohol levels, because that's what the yeast is designed to do. But during the production process, we keep those levels very, very low, because at the end of the day, they're detrimental to yeast and yeast performance. You know, so what we do is we meter in oxygen, we meter in molasses substrate, and we're constantly maintaining that at very, very low levels. You know, if we get more than 0.3 alcohol during our production process, there's something going wrong, you know. And yeast manufacturing is a relatively difficult thing, you know.
Any other questions?
Question for Susan. You said that normally if you pick this at 27 bricks, you would water it back to 25. And I'm just curious, why not pick it at 25? What are you getting? What are you getting by picking it at 27 instead?
Why not pick it at 25? You know, sometimes you can't get to the vineyard. This one is actually a state, so we have a lot more flexibility, but sometimes you'll say, I want to pick on this date, and you can't get it until 5 to 7 days later. So, you know, it's all logistics, bringing stuff into the winery. And this one we were actually stressing. We were pushing for more sugar. So we wanted, and we knew going in that we had selected this vineyard for this experiment. So, but yeah, it's, you know, it's not perfect. We try for perfection.
Yes.
We strive for perfection, but we rarely meet it.
Last question? Yeah, okay.
Jason, what do you say high alcohol? What numbers?
High alcohols? What numbers? I mean, It depends on, kind of what you're fermenting, because obviously there's, we can talk about grapes, kind of, and high alcohol. In terms of grapes, kind of wine yeast, and, kind of manufacturers have to be very careful what they state the yeast will go to. Just on the back of the result at University of California, Davis, I believe that one of our strains can ferment to over 19 degrees alcohol. Would I put that on a technical data sheet and guarantee that? No, I wouldn't. I think that generally, kind of, there is the expectation that certain strains can comfortably go to 16.5, 17 degrees. A lot of it is how that's managed, kind of. And if we talk about bioethanol production, kind of, we're looking at, kind of, perhaps late 19s, 20 degrees alcohol, those are sort of the high, numbers we're talking about. It's very rare to get above those sorts of numbers.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions. Can I just see by the raise of hands, we cannot discuss the wines, unfortunately, but who preferred wine 1 out of the 4 wines? Wine 2? There's some wine 2, wine 3, wine 4. So it's between wine 3, wine 4, and T2. So thanks a lot for your attention. Thanks a lot for visiting us. And thanks for my speakers. Susan, thanks for doing the trials at CIMI. We appreciate that. Thank you.